Let me read to you a passage from the 24th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 13 to 35. It's the Gospel for Easter Wednesday. I will only read part of it because it is a very long passage. St. Luke writes, "Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, 'What are you discussing together as you walk along?' They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, 'Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem, and do not know the things that have happened there these days?' 'What things?' he asked. 'About Jesus of Nazareth,' they replied. 'He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place.'" That, and the rest of the passage, is from Luke 24, verses 13 to 35, for Easter Wednesday. What does it suggest to us? Well, it suggests how Jesus Christ is our companion on our journey. The scene is just outside Jerusalem, and it is the first day of the new week, with the great Sabbath now over. All is quiet, and the weather is marked by a sombre peace. The occasional cry of a bird is perhaps heard, but apart from that, there is just the subdued voice of the two companions walking on the lonely road leading away from the city. We might even say that the quiet of the morning has a touch of the eerie about it, and that this has been so ever since the Friday afternoon 2 days before. A great prophet had suddenly met a terrible end, orchestrated and achieved by the religious leaders no less. This wonderful man had traversed the country and filled it with his person, with his teaching, and with his miraculous deeds. A little over a week before, he had spectacularly raised a person from the dead after 4 days in the tomb, just outside the city itself. He had entered the city, cleansed the temple of its markets, and set up teaching in its precincts. For his disciples, he was the hope of the nation. He, they thought, would be the one to set Israel free, for there was no limit to his goodness and his power. A great shock had enveloped his friends and disciples, for the light of their life had been snuffed out. At the moment of his terrible demise, the very earth had rocked. He was now gone. The two lonely walkers continued along the road for the village of Emmaus, their voices subdued, their feelings profoundly depressed. They were lost in their brooding thoughts as they noticed a little distance behind them another solitary walker heading along the road in the same direction as they. They slowed and allowed him to join them as their fitful discussion paused. He quietly reached them, and perhaps they allowed him to walk between them, with one on either side. They were absolutely downcast. "What were you discussing?" he courteously asked. They stood, distressed, and asked him in wonderment, "How could you ask this? Are you a visitor? And do you not know what has just happened here?" The scene is so real, so vivid, so full of factual detail. There is nothing of the mere story to it. It is not a tale, a myth, something of a fable. It is the report of facts that had happened years before the writing of the account. A remarkable thing was occurring in this simple historical scene. Jesus of Nazareth, who had been mercilessly bundled to his terrible death by ruthless religious leaders, was alive in the flesh and walking on the road with his two companions. There was absolutely nothing like it in all the annals of history. This extraordinary circumstance was unfolding in the midst of the most simple ordinariness. The two depressed and perplexed companions had between them the risen Jesus. They saw him, they heard him, and his physical presence was just as palpable as had been the presence of each of them one to the other. They did not recognize him as yet, perhaps because his fullness of risen life gave to him a special newness, and also because there was simply no expectation in them of their ever seeing him again. But as they would soon learn, it was the same Jesus, and he was joining them in their ordinary life. He was not coming to them in thunder and glory, just as he had not come in thunder and glory to Mary Magdalene just a few hours before. He came risen and victorious, but as one of them. They were still his brothers, and he was talking, taking the time, as it were, to be with two ordinary disciples. Why was it that he spent so long a time with two relatively obscure disciples, one being Cleopas? We have no idea, but it tells us that the risen Jesus joins us in our daily life just as he joined them. As we walk along the road of life towards our goal, we are often depressed with the perplexities of our calling. He, the risen Jesus, is walking with us in all those perplexities of our ordinary and everyday life. He wants to know what is in our minds, and he wants us to let him cast his light on us. There can never be such a companion as Jesus Christ for our journey. The same risen Jesus joins us in so many ways in everyday life. He resides in his body, the church, as its head. We are the church's members and therefore members of Jesus Christ. We are the branches, he is the vine. He comes to us in the preaching and teaching of the church. He comes to us above all in the sacraments, and in particular on a regular basis in the sacraments of the Eucharist and penance. Let us pause every day to let him join us and enliven our hearts with his words and his grace. In those two disciples are exemplified each one of us. Let Christ be our companion as we journey along the way to our true homeland.